me introduce to you our guests. Some of you may actually work for them. Superintendent Jim Mills of North Clackamas District. Jim. Superintendent Jim Schlachter of Gresham Barlow District. Superintendent Jeff Rose of the Canby Schools. And Associate Professor of Education at the Portland State University Graduate School of Education at Burke. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you, if you can, to share the mics a little bit. They actually can be taken out of holders if you need to. So I asked you, or Gail Hayes Davis, and I also asked you to prepare a question for Dr. Gardner that you find particularly interesting and think you might be able to shed some light upon. So just hold those mics up when you're going to use them, and let me start with Tim.
It is absolutely great to be here. Dr. Gardner, I'm curious, as we are now in this age of high accountability for school districts that seems to be focused on one set of metrics, what are you seeing or understanding in terms of international comparisons that align with the way of thinking that you've outlined for us here today? It seems like we're so focused on test scores, and that limits oftentimes the work that goes on in a classroom, because we really need to be sure that we're meeting those accountability measures. But how do we compare, or how do we measure how we are doing on this larger international stage in the way of thinking that you've outlined here today?
Well, I think the only use for me here is to be very honest about things. And with the recognition that, I have a lot more luxury than three of you do. You have one professor here, he's got so much more luxury. I have a line that I often use, which is, I've traveled the world and talked to ministers all over, and the major question that they ask is, how are we doing in international comparisons? If I could shut them off totally, I would, because I think it's an enormous diversion for this country. And I think it's a diversion because the strength of this country has never been, particularly in its educational system, it's been in the broader society, because number one, we had a frontier, and the only frontier left is the cyber frontier, and we're actually doing very well there. We're leaders there, the science side of thing. Number two, immigrants, inviting people from all over the world to come here, and because they admire here, they stay. And the focus on scores, particularly on that unilinear dimension, closes off the first option, because it's basically regressive. It's preparing people for the 18th or 19th century, not for the 21st century. And meanwhile, this was the not very secret message of the second part of my talk, making us not a society which people admire anymore. In my lifetime, the United States has evolved from a society which is mostly admired, even by countries which ostensibly hate us, that people want to come here, to a place which is admired, in Poland and a few other places and that. So I think it's an absolutely disastrous model. Now, you're saying to yourself, but I don't want you, I literally don't want to play to the crowd, even though I appreciate the sentiments. I've recently encountered a very useful way of thinking about things. It didn't come from me, it came from a columnist in the New York Times. And it's the way of thinking which I wish Barack Obama had embraced on day one. Because I think we'd be in a different place now if he had. And I hope that this is useful to those of you who are in the hot seat as leaders of educational enterprises. What I wish Barack Obama had said is, we've got a short-term crisis and a long-term set of challenges. And what we need to deal with now is the short-term crisis. But this country is going to go down the tubes unless we also engage with seriousness and over the long run. That's the difference between biennial and quarterly and 15, 20-year periods, these bigger issues. And if he had said that, he could have said, we need to save the banks in Wall Street, and we need to have a stimulus package, because if we don't do these things, our whole economy could be down the tubes. And it hasn't gone down the tubes, it just hasn't gotten better. But, this is my new elevator speech for Obama, I just realized. If we don't tackle the health system, the educational system, the climate energy thing, we are doomed as a country. And we have to start those things, and there are going to be dislocations. But in a wonderful book Danielle Allen wrote, she said we have to think of ourselves not in terms of anybody getting everything, but in terms of all of us giving up something because we think we're going to get something else in return. And everybody has to give up on these educational, energy, climate, health things. But if we believe we're going to get something in return, we're more likely to do it. That's the we. So how does this relate to schools? Even if you hated the testing system and the international comparison, you're not going to be able to shut it off. I often joke that, isn't it ironic, the one thing in this country that we have a bipartisan agreement about are the educational innovations, because it goes all the way back to the Charlottesville Summit in 1989, and there's no difference between Bush spellings and Obama Duncan. So the joke is, should we be really happy that we all agree on this? It was just proof that we're wrong, since we're wrong about everything else. But you're not going to change it in the short run, because it's a bipartisan agreement, and I wouldn't even want it to be changed, because I think it would be worse to kind of undo it. But here's the punchline. If you don't believe that education is more than test scores, and if you don't believe that educators aren't simply cogs in a wheel, but people who are professionals, and as Michael will say, who need to have career paths and enough of an income that they don't have to have a third job and put their kids to work when they're 5 years old. Unless you believe that and are willing to tackle it, you shouldn't be in your position. What you need to be in your position, and here I'm lecturing you, so forgive me, is to be in it long enough to build up enough trust that people will go along with what you say. And even though I'm not particularly in sympathy with Joel Klein and Michael Bloomberg, and certainly was not in sympathy with, this is New York, with Michelle Reed in DC, I'd rather have them stay there and at least try to do what they're doing than to have another revolving urban superintendent, whereas you all know the classical term is about 2 years, and it isn't that people leave to sell insurance, they simply move from Atlanta to New Orleans, to Pittsburgh, to Houston, and they tell the same lies in each place. So that's even worse. So this is a longer answer than you probably wanted in more than one sense, but I hope there's at least one or two shards which are relevant to the question.
Jim Schlachter, please.
Gail warned me it might be hard to figure out where to go next after you saw questions.
I'll be brief.
Your comments earlier about quarterly and biennial is particularly true here in the state of Oregon, where our budgets, we used to believe were biennial, but now we get quarterly updates that cause us to make reductions. And in spite of the fact that I think up here we are all in agreement that a broad-based curriculum that involves the electives and the arts is important, the hard reality is that we keep having to reduce those things. What are your thoughts in terms of hope as I look at your depth, breadth, and stretch, where you said is not necessarily tied just to the arts, but that is really there in all of our academic study. Are you seeing signs of hope with folks who are really applying those even to the important core curriculum, but maybe in the absence of funding the other kinds of things?
Okay, good question. I want to make one general comment. I'm from Massachusetts, and our system is very well thought of in the rest of the country. And our big city is Boston, and Boston has all the problems that other big cities have, but we've had a very steady superintendency, 10 years of Tom Payzant, and a rather smooth superintendency for a successor, Carol Johnson. And I think that longer run has been very good for the state. A lot of things have been set in place. And even though I was initially very much against core national standards for lots of reasons, I'm hopeful that the ones that have come out, which are fairly Massachusetts in their inflection, will be taken up. I think they are being taken up, at least as long as there's stimulus money. And I think that would be good for the country. So those are kind of rays of hope in what I think is a bleak picture. I'm not close enough to what's going on around the country. In fact, to be blunt, I'm closer to what's going on in other parts of the world, because there's more interest in our work in other parts of the world than there is in the United States, and that's probably an interesting bit of data in itself. And what I realized a long time ago, Jim, is that the kinds of ideas our group is working on, Project Zero, teaching for understanding, personalization, things like that, anywhere in the world you go, it's a minority interest. By minority, I don't mean demographically. I mean, it wouldn't win a vote. And so my goal has always been to keep things loose enough that at least people who want to do those kinds of things aren't snuffed out, as they could easily be. So my guess, in answer to your question, is in any place of any size, you're going to find some folks who are doing these kind of experiments, and either are good enough in the tests or bad enough that they're seen as hopeless, but they're not kicked out, they'll continue. But the mainstream, I think, is basically not impacted. I think that the test scores drive everything. I was reading your paper today, and the big headline is more schools are now proficient, but then the small print says, oh yes, they raised the grade standards to do it. And that's been true in New York, where they had to step back, and in Houston it was an embarrassment. And I think that's really the major game that's being played. I will say, because we have people here from this entity, that I guess it's an Oregon, Washington Young Artists, Young Audiences Collaborative, has just won a big grant from the government to try to do what is generally called arts infusion, namely take some art forms and some art practices and use them across the curricula. And what I heard, it's a very promising endeavor that ought to be watched carefully. But if you ask me to predict, even if it's a tremendous success, will the arts infusion be picked up elsewhere? I would predict no, because the arts are not considered important in the United States as they are in other countries. The other part of your question is, will there be more stretching across the curriculum? And the answer there is very simple. To the extent that assessments will look at stretching, as well as what I call subject matter knowledge, the more with it districts will tweak their curricula accordingly. The biggest failure of the progressive movement in education, of which I was a very active member in the 80s, 90s, is we never came up with assessments which were seen as being good enough to compete with the ETS short answer kind of thing. So I think that, to me, that's key.
Thank you.